understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have a Master of Divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
So today is episode 26, and it's March. So March is Women's History Month. So we thought it would be a good time to do an episode on this phrase, pastor's wife.
Oh boy.
Ooh, I have a lot to say about this phrase. And I'm going to start out by being super honest. Technically, I'm a pastor's wife.
Are you?
I'm the wife of a pastor. I will be honest, I don't like this phrase for myself, pastor's wife, because the history of it. I don't feel this identity. For me, I could really get into it, but I won't. Well, a little bit I will. But for me, it's as simple as Dillon is not called an author's husband or a professor's husband, right? Dillon's work in the world, although I support him, meaning I volunteer at our church, but I would do that anyway, even if I wasn't married to the pastor. Also, I listen to some of his sermons before he gives them. When he does different things, he'll run it by me first. But just as much when I'm writing a book, I read him every chapter out loud as I edit, right? I'm not saying that supporting your pastor's spouse is something I'm against, but this title, this role of pastor's wife is not something I live into at all. Now, I have been called a pastor's wife by some people, and I would never cause a stink about it, but that's because I'm grateful to be at a church that doesn't make me feel any kind of pressure and is not hung up on the pastor's wife having any kind of specific role or duty. I don't have that. Do you have thoughts initially?
Well,
Or just on your stance of pastor's wife and what
not
that
my
means?
stance on pastor's wife, or I almost said wives, yikes.
Or me as a pastor's wife?
As a pastor's, no, not particularly. But for our listening audience, we are members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is a mainline Protestant denomination that is rather progressive in its understanding of number one, ordination.
I don't even like the term progressive because it feels so political. Okay. I get what you're saying.
Inclusive.
Yeah, it just feels
inclusive.
Humane.
Yeah.
Respects the dignity of all human beings despite how they're born.
You are correct. It is the ELCA, which is the acronym for our denomination. The ELCA Lutheran Church is extremely inclusive in its understanding of ordination, and so this podcast or this episode is not talking about the ordination of women, although we will do one on that.
Yes,
this is talking about
on ordination in general.
Yeah, this is talking about pastors' wives, but in our denomination, it's not the pastor's wife role has kind of been something that has become much less of a thing because our denomination since the early 1970s, actually 1970, with Elizabeth Platts. She was the first woman to be ordained in the Lutheran Church in the United States. And so since we have had women pastors, the role of a pastor's wife has become a lot less, number one, formal, a lot less emphasized. And so with the inclusion of the ordination of women, our denomination hasn't for over 50 years has not.
Never expect a pastor's husband to do the work of a pastor's wife.
Although there's many there's many pastor spouses.
Yes.
So you have a female pastor, and they're married to a man. That man does do many things in the church. The ELCA also has ordained LGBT clergy, so you could have two women or two men. So it's to a lesser extent.
Yeah,
the
but
pastor's wife.
I think that talking about ordination, meaning who can be a pastor or be ordained clergy, sometimes deacons are ordained, like in our church they are, right? But let's just talk about pastors, because pastors' wives, right? So we need to talk about, we're going to get into the history of it, but we need to talk about ordination, because you just hit on something really important. In denominations that ordain women, where women can be pastors, now our church also ordains people in the queer community, the LGBTQIA plus community, which I think is beautiful, and I love that. But I do think it's really telling about the churches, even us, right? I'm not going to apologize or be an apologeticist, rather. I'm not going to defend what even Lutherans have done wrong. It's interesting that we're okay with having this expected unpaid role and duties, and we're going to get into what that is, of a pastor's wife. But as soon as the church decides we're going to ordain women, well, then this pastor's wife role should probably not really be a thing, because we can't expect husbands to do this, right? Which shows that, like, oh, you're okay with oppressing women. It's not the spouse supporting the clergy. It's the subordination of women that you were interested in all along, because once a man is in this role, now suddenly the role is different. I think that's interesting. I have hope that one day we will have a female president, and if that female president is a straight person, and if that female president is married, and there is a first gentleman, I'm curious to see, is he going to be doing all the duties of the first lady? Because the first lady historically has done a lot with decorating and a lot with fashion, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I am curious to see, is there a different set of expectations for this man? I just think that's an interesting gender study to talk about.
It is, but not to get on this, but we have during the Biden administration, during the Biden-Harris administration, you did see that Vice President Kamala Harris, her spouse, who is a man, her husband, did indeed take on the office of the second gentleman, and he was a person who continued. That is a specific office. He had a chief of staff. That he went to events. He did different types of things.
Tours.
So there was a role for him to play as the spouse of the vice president for the first time. That the roles were reversed.
I just wonder how much wiggle room there was. Like, if a woman comes into that position, it's almost expected this is what you do. But I'm willing to bet, now I don't know, but I'm willing to bet with a man, there's probably like, well, typically this is what she would do, but you could not.
Oh, sure.
I bet
there's a lot of
wiggle room.
sexism going on there too.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Interesting. Okay, so we already kind of touched on this, but I do want to just say this up front before we really dive into what the pastor's wife role historically was. Again, I'll get into that, but I thank God to belong to a church that ordains women, and you can't talk about the role of a pastor's wife without talking about ordination. And if you don't know what that means, we should do a whole episode on that. But ordination is just, how would you just quickly describe it in 10 seconds or less? It's the process, it's the stamp of approval somebody needs in order to be
ordination.
A pastor.
Is both a process and a ceremony that it's the process an individual goes through to become a pastor, and the ordination itself is a ceremony that specifically includes the anointing and laying on of hands, at least in the Lutheran Church, and it installs you into the office of pastor or other bishop, not bishop, but deacon.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's.
So I want to say this very clearly and very boldly. If the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA, which is what we are, decided tomorrow, now Dillon and I have extensively spoken about this. So if they decided tomorrow as a national church that women could not be pastors, equally I'll say if they decided tomorrow that members of the LGBT community could not be pastors, I would have two options and two options only. If I wanted to be an authentic human who loves thy neighbor, I would have two choices. One, me and my children would no longer be Lutheran. We would get the heck out of there. We would leave the church. There's plenty of other churches who would be willing to do it. And if all of Christianity tomorrow formally decided to not ordain women or to ordain anybody who felt this call, we just wouldn't belong to a church anymore. That's how strongly I feel about it. The second option, now, if I wasn't a mother, this is probably the option I would choose, but because I am a mother and my children go to our church, I'm not sure. But the second option is I would stay and I would speak out and I would get very involved and I would refuse to leave Lutheranism to this descent of injustice, right? I feel like those are the two choices. So I just want to start there, that ordination matters, and we'll talk about how it's all intertwined with this role of pastor's wife. So if the ELCA National Church decided tomorrow that these people could not be ordained, those are the choices if this is something that we care about. Staying silently wouldn't even be an option for me. I'd either stay and change or I'd get the heck out of there. Because I'm a mother, I'd probably get the heck out of there and not subject my children to that kind of optional space. But
I would not be an ordained pastor in any denomination that does not ordain women. I have felt very strong about that even before I was a pastor.
It's one of the reasons we are Lutheran.
One of the reasons why, Lutheranism is our tradition. And so both being a pastor and supporting women's ordination, as well as even before I was a pastor, like I said, I supported women's ordination. So I could never be a part of a denomination that didn't. In terms, there is almost zero probability that would ever happen in our own denomination.
That's what I was going to say next. It's not even a debate.
Almost zero probability. So that's not ever even a worry for us. But in terms of staying, I agree with Samantha. We have two daughters. Maybe one of them, maybe none of them will feel a call to ministry. I want our two daughters to know that they have a church tradition that would indeed accept that call if they were wanting to become a deacon or a pastor, or maybe they become a pastor. Maybe one day, this is the old joke, but maybe one day, your daughter becomes the bishop. That's kind of a beautiful thing. But when you're not in that realm or that land, you have children, specifically young girls, that say, well, that's never an option for me. And
yes. So Dillon and I are talking about something almost from the outside looking in, because we belong to a Christian denomination where this is a non-issue. Ordaining women is not even a thing that's up for debate in our national church. Maybe specific churches don't love it, but I'm not sure. But that's not
I even think
our
that
church.
That has...
The pastor at our church before Dillon was a woman. Mm-hmm. It's just not even a thing. In fact, I'll say this. Here's something interesting. I'm a pastor's wife. Ugh, I even hate saying it, but I'm married to a pastor. Dillon technically is my pastor, but that's a weird thing to say because there are certain things that pastors do that Dillon will never do for me. For example, pastors give your funeral. If I died tomorrow, please let me live a long time. But Dillon would not do my funeral. Some people go to counseling with their pastor. Dillon will not counsel me.
Isn't our whole life a counseling
Yeah,
session?
I do kind of feel like I get the benefits of your pastoral personality because you're my husband, but there's not there's certain things that pastors do for people that my husband won't do for me because there's a weird blurred line. But so I guess technically Dillon is my pastor, but besides Dillon, I've never had a male pastor.
Well,
ever. So our first pastor together who married us was female.
Right.
A St. Paul's woman. Mm-hmm. I've never had a male pastor, which honestly works for me because I don't do well with male authority for my own complex reasons that, trust me, I've been in therapy for. But I never thought of it until this moment. I'm like, oh yeah, Dillon's the first male who I've really gone to church and even heard preach on a regular basis. Or that's interesting.
Yeah, well, in the Lutheran Church, there's a decently high percentage of women pastors. Our denomination has a lot of women pastors.
Yeah. Well, as long as I'm in this kind of confessional mode too, I do want to say, and some people who are listening might be surprised by this, maybe not, or maybe they don't even care. If I could choose any denomination, if Catholics ordained women and LGBT people, I think I'd be Catholic.
Oh.
The more
Oh.
I love being Lutheran. I'll probably always be Lutheran.
Oh.
Episcopal is another one, but the more into church history studying I go, I like high church. I just like the whole tradition of it. I don't know. And going to Rome really like made me want to buy a rosary. I didn't. I made that decision not to. But
Are you a purgatory lady? Are you? Oh boy.
Listen, I could get there fast. I'm sure that there are certain things about Catholicism. I'm not anti-Catholic by any means, though.
No, either am I.
wish they ordained everybody. And so let's just dive into it, actually. So I do...
Well, real quick before we dive into it, I
Yeah.
would just like to make it known, too, that the interesting thing that connects both you and me as a couple, as a married couple, and you see this with pastors and pastors' wives, or if there is a female pastor and her spouse, or whatever the case may be there, you and I have pastoral colleagues that I seek wisdom from and talk to, right?
Right.
But you and I are both pastorless.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
You and I are both pastorless.
In this weird limbo. I mean, technically the bishop is supposed to be
Well,
your
the bishop
pastor.
is officially the bishop is
there's not a
my
regular-
pastor. If I were to die, hopefully not anytime soon, the traditional understanding in the Lutheran Church is that the bishop does pastors' funerals.
Who does the funeral for a pastor's wife or spouse or partner?
That would also fall under usually the traditional role of the bishop.
Ooh.
But you could have whoever you want.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, let's not talk about that. That's
Yeah,
just
I know,
morbid.
I know. Okay, so a quick side note. I just want to like really make this point, and then we're really going to dive into the history of this phrase, pastor's wife, and the role, and it gets really scary. So again, Dillon and I are Lutherans. We don't experience this, so we're kind of talking not from experience, but like on the outside looking in. But just know that there are people, there are denominations, there are full systems set up where if you are married to a pastor, and most of these churches, only a man can be a pastor. If you are married to a pastor, if you are a pastor's wife, that is a role. There's unpaid labor attached, and husbands can be fired for your beliefs as a pastor's wife and for your behavior as a pastor's wife. And we're going to get into that.
Especially if you're a Protestant pastor and your wife is talking about maybe flirting with the Catholic Church. That was a joke. But
So, a quick side note. People are dying in wars. Children in our communities are living out of their car. Children are going hungry, likely within a few miles of where you live. I know for sure within a mile from where I live. Teenagers are in so much pain that they are sticking needles in their arms. Loving parents can't find work that pays well enough to support their families. Churches who are created and equipped to help with these problems and actually make this world more like the kingdom that Jesus was talking about. Some of these churches are, from my view, wasting their resources, energy by debating the role of women. And I believe this is insanity. So let's just start there. I can't even fathom. I play this game sometimes in my imagination. I think a lot of us do. If Jesus were to come right now, just be here and kind of do like an assessment on the church, I think he would find this absurd of like, you're arguing about what? You're worried about what? Like, there's children starving. There's 15-year-olds sticking needles in their arms 2 miles from their house because they're so distraught. They're struggling so much. And you're arguing about who can be in charge? This is insanity. Just crazy, right? So the reason we're talking about women pastors is because Christian churches that typically do not ordain women as pastors are often the same churches that have expectations of pastors' wives. So that's the correlation. So let's start with this phrase, pastor's wife. I study language, so let's start by talking about the linguistics of the language. This phrase, pastor's wife, is not biblical because the word pastor is not biblical. If you read usually older translations, like the King James Version definitely has it, you might see the word pastor, but if you go back to the original language, it's shepherd. That word is shepherd. And sometimes it's translated as pastor. The role of pastor is actually
usually real quick. It's actually usually it's shepherd, but the shepherd has been translated to a word almost nobody's familiar with anymore. Is presbyter.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
And the presbyter
But the way it's discussed biblically is not attached to a pastor the way we know it today.
No.
In the early church, if you were to go into a church and say, who's the pastor here? Or even say, who's in charge here? They would have no comprehension of what you mean.
No
that wasn't
idea.
a thing. The role of pastor is not biblical. That doesn't mean it's not important. Christianity has always extended beyond the Bible, but that does mean, by default, the role of pastor's wife is not a biblical thing. So if anybody tries to make that argument, just full stop right there, look at the language. It's not there. Would you agree?
I would agree. And yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to say something, but I don't think it fits here right now.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you've been listening to this podcast since October, you already know, we say this all the time, Christianity extends beyond the Bible, and this is not a problem. Church tradition has always gone beyond the Bible. So let's talk about this term pastor's wife now that we got the Bible out of the way. It's not there, right? And you can look at men and women in the Bible, and people are doing this. They have debates all the time about what a man does and what a woman does. But let's just talk about culture and theology, and then we're going to really get into the history. So this phrase, pastor's wife, it reflects a conservative cultural and theological idea about gender and marriage. So in early Christianity, clergy actually weren't even often married. Now, let's even remember Paul. He talked a lot about not getting married because they were really under the impression that Jesus was coming back soon, so why even bother? Right? Mm-hmm. Simply put. So Paul was not married. And then from there on out, a lot of clergy in early Christianity, they weren't married. So to put a strong emphasis on the role of a pastor's wife is actually kind of strange if you start there. And if you're like me and you've never experienced a church that is structured in these kind of sexist ways, this might sound irrelevant. I didn't grow up in a church. I didn't grow up in any church, but I didn't grow up with a church. I didn't even grow up in a family with direct messages in my childhood that women couldn't hold certain roles. That wasn't a message I got. I'm not super hung up on that. No. I did grow up, just like everybody else, with some deeply ingrained sexism, like everybody else in this culture. I'm not exempt from that, but I don't see it that way. So if this is like, oh, the pastor's wife, whatever, just know that for many people, some of them that we know, this is a huge problem. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, there is this odd passage. The word pastor is, as Samantha said, not found in the Bible. There's things that allude to the practices that a pastor now does in modern day, the modern day church, but that word has evolved over time. That title. Mm-hmm. But there is a passage, I can't remember if it's in the Timothy's, 1st or 2nd Timothy. There is a passage.
We're going to do a whole episode on pastor too.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is it says a pastor should have one wife.
That's interesting. Yeah.
A pastor should have one wife because there was two things going on here.
A practice of poly.
There was a practice of polyamory, which was rampant throughout the Roman Empire.
And once again, not women having multiple husbands, but a husband having multiple wives. That's the thing, right? It's again about power.
So polyamory in its cultural practice was rampant. However, under Roman law, a man was required to only have one wife.
Yeah.
And so because there was a cultural understanding of trying to make the church match up culturally with the empire, a pastor would only have one wife. Now, obviously, during that time, following after the Jewish tradition of the time, it was a man who was in that role, but would have one wife. So there is that illusion.
Yes, but also that the way they're using pastor, again, it's only translated as pastor sometimes in older things. It's shepherd or presbyter. It's not talking about a specific role in the church.
Correct, and it's not. And although it's saying a pastor should have one wife, it is not giving a specific office or a role to which that wife is required to play.
Right. It's not even giving a role of the pastor in that context.
No.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
But
that's interesting.
But there is that kind of.
It's there. Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
Because of because of the Roman culture, but also the Roman laws of a man only having one wife.
Yeah, that's good. So you've probably heard me say this in earlier episodes, but for my doctoral research, I spent a few months interviewing a bunch of women who identify or who grew up in a Christian church. Some of them still identify as Christian. Most of them do, but it's a little messy for them. And this is a really important topic for me, just women in the church in general, because whenever I was interviewing these women, I heard I can't be specific because when you do research, there's ethical things where you can only share in certain publications and you have to change their name and all these things. But I heard such emotional stories from women about their experiences in these kinds of churches that don't ordain women. And a lot of them talked about their pastor's wife, because their pastor's wife was seen as part of the staff, but was not seen as a leader. And we'll talk about that soon. But I will say that a majority of these women, more than half of these women that I interviewed, they cried while I was interviewing them. It was heartbreaking. They were told that they had to grow up, get married, and have babies, so that's what they did. And as mothers who love their children and husbands very much, they are not as fulfilled as they were told they were supposed to feel. And there was guilt and trauma around that. And they had this guilt about their life and even their sexuality, because they were told they weren't allowed to have a sexuality. And all of a sudden they get married and now they're told they're allowed to have a sexuality. It was just this whole thing. They were told that their desire to be in any kind of leadership position in the world was a problem. They were told that their desire to have, or not their desire, but their opinions weren't allowed to be expressed, right? And they were taught they had to give, and they could never take anything they felt called towards, right? They were told that they have to have a life of service, but they were never allowed they were robbed of joy as women, right? And they, as adults now with children, because I interviewed only mothers, many of these mothers I interviewed, they can't even step inside a church. They'll call themselves Christians, but they're like, I can't go into a church. I've tried, but it is just too painful. That is what a majority of these women have told me, which is heartbreaking.
That's heartbreaking that the church as a community have done that to so many women in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, as a pastor, I think that is just heinous, which many communities have done.
Well, you and I know some people who grew up in churches like this.
We do.
And imagine, so there are some people who grow up and they realize the harm and they leave, but there's some people who don't leave. And there are some women who grow up in these kinds of church communities and then they grow up and marry a pastor. And I'll tell you that on Instagram, because of the fancy algorithms, once in a while I'll see pastor's wife things show up. There is a community of young girls and women who want to be a pastor's wife. They're on social media dressing the part of like a trad wife, of like a traditional wife of like long dresses, homemaker, and they are literally like advertising themselves to be a pastor's wife. That's what they want to do, which is really interesting to me. As a feminist, I want to say, yeah, you do you, girl. And that is about half of me, is like, yeah, if that's what you want, because for sure, some people are called to a life of domesticity. There's nothing wrong with that. That can be beautiful.
Yes, but the very thing that they're doing by being on TikTok or Instagram or something like that is not following under the traditional understanding.
Right, I'm going to talk about that.
Of coming under male authority.
Yes.
Because they have their own accounts and their own, things. Real quick too. Could we just do a little bunny trail segue?
About
here?
what?
About the pastor's wife and the pastor, because there is in the New Testament there was a split between the offices. It's called there was a split between the offices. The role which we now know as pastor, or a preacher and administrator of the sacraments, specifically baptism and communion, you see that people are preaching and administering the sacraments, and that has become the pastor role or the shepherd role. But then there was a split, and you see this is specifically. Thank you. In the book of Acts, and then there are people of the deacon role. And the deacon role are acts of word and service to the community. And what's very interesting in many of these more conservative communities, where it is the male pastor and the female pastor's wife, you see that the pastor's wife is almost directly acting out and living the office of deacon. They are doing outreach ministry, they are doing hunger ministry, they are taking the word and putting action into it by collecting canned goods and doing clothing drives and all these things that has been specifically in the New Testament church the office of deacon, and they have and remain administering it, and they're not even given the title
or the pay.
I'll
do you one further.
And so here's an interesting thing. But in the Lutheran Church, even before the Lutheran Church in the United States ordained women, there was a very, we could do an episode on this. There was called the deaconess community. And it was a community of female deacons. And they were a very powerful community. They were not ordained at that time. They were consecrated, which there's just a little slight difference there. But and it was a paid position. Not all the time. Sometimes it was volunteer. But it's interesting because the pastor's wife is doing what many people, including myself, would see as a very clear role of the office of deacon.
But I want to do you one even further. Sure. Many pastors' wives, even today, they're doing the job of a deacon. They're doing the job of a pastor. Pastors' wives are preaching. They are doing counseling alongside their husbands. They are doing missionary work.
Oh,
They are teaching just like a pastor would. They're doing everything a pastor would do. They're doing it alongside their husband. They're even doing it in this role of pastor's wife. But in these churches, they don't get paid and they don't get to be called pastor.
Well, they don't get, yes, and I know that this might mean not so much to a lot of people, especially if you're not living or a part of a liturgical church. But what these more conservative churches, where they have this role of pastor and pastor's wife, what they really don't allow women to do, which at least in our church is a very privileged duty for the pastor to do, is they will not allow women. They might let them preach and do these other things. They will not let them administer the sacraments. A woman cannot baptize someone.
Yeah.
A woman cannot preside at the table of communion. They cannot consecrate communion. So those two things, which is almost the linchpins of the sacraments, they are not permitted to do that.
Yeah, when it comes to women in leadership, I'm going to quote Father Richard Rohr here, which he commonly says these days, which is, give me a break. I don't even have the time or energy for it anymore. Like, give me a break. Can we just move beyond this, like, women can't do what men can do and men can't do what women can do? Like, give me a break. I'm like, so I played that game for 20 years of like entering the debate of it, and now I'm so far like, okay, can we just move into the next thing?
And I'm going to be snarky for a minute. Now, I love Father Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan Roman Catholic priest, and I love his work. He is so good. And let me just state this. This is my snarky. So I am in full 100% support of Richard Rohr and Richard Rohr's understanding of religion and the world. However, Father Richard Rohr, is an official member of the clergy of a church that does not ordain women to the priesthood or the diaconate to the deacons. And he is saying, yeah, give me a break. And I get that. And he has come out, or at least alluded to, that he supports women's ordination. So that he has done. And yet, he's a part of a huge institutional church.
Ooh, I think I'm about to disagree with you.
He's a part
But remember what I said in the beginning?
I know, he's fighting against it.
Yes.
I know.
People, we live in the world of cancel culture. If you don't agree, leave. And listen, I said in the beginning, if Lutherans tomorrow wake up and decide we're not ordaining women and queer people, I have two choices, and both of them are equally valid. One, I can leave and refuse to be a part of it. And that's a valid choice, and that can bring about change. A second choice is stay and keep your worldview in the mix. Because if there is a large institution, whether it's a church or some other organization, when there is a community and something in that community goes awry and everybody who disagrees leaves, you're just leaving that community now to go down that path of dissension, right? Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
so
I'm
Richard
with you.
Rohr,
I'm with you.
being a Catholic, I used to think that way.
I'm not saying
now
I
I
think that
think-
way. I'm just saying I could see how people would think that way.
Richard Rohr has also earned my undying loyalty. There are not many people in this world who I would... Richard Rohr is one of those people where if they came out tomorrow that he was a part of some, like, scandal, my heart would be broken. Because
mine
he's been
too.
such
Mine too.
a formative voice in my life.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying some people would see, oh, this male Catholic priest is saying, give me a break.
Yeah.
He's a part of one of the biggest institutions.
He is.
But
staying matters.
It does matter. And I'm not saying that I think that. I'm saying, let me just be snarky and twisted a little bit, because that is what some people might think.
Yeah, there's a reason why I said in the beginning of this episode that if Lutherans tomorrow decided to only ordain men, I said me and my children would leave. I didn't say my family would leave, because I could see a reality in which you stayed and became very active as a Lutheran pastor to be a voice of opposition.
Oh, no.
I don't know if that's what you would do. I'm not sure.
I would...
But it's an option.
I would definitely be in opposition, but I have said this multiple times. I love being Lutheran. I love being a Lutheran pastor. I love our Lutheran history and liturgy and teachings. I am Lutheran through and through, and yet, if something like that happened, I would probably be a person that would rally around speaking against people who are wanting to take those rights and privileges away from women and LGBT people, and yet at the same...
Not a privilege, a right.
I'm sorry, yes, a right. And yet at the same time, I could be an Episcopalian tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, so
there's other groups.
So, yeah.
Well, so pastor's wife. We're going to get into the history now. That was a 36-minute intro, but there's a lot to say about gender and everything. So to understand this role of a pastor's wife and why some churches have a very stringent expectation of a pastor's wife, first we have to understand this word complementarianism.
Ugh.
So to understand the role of the pastor's wife, we have to first unpack this word. And there's full books dedicated, full conferences around this word. So we're just going to give you a taste. But this term, complementarianism, you can Google it if you want. It's the theological belief that men and women complement each other and therefore have separate roles. And on the surface, you might be thinking, well, I could get there. I get that. Because listen, I'm a queer affirming person. And I also understand the difference between a man and a woman. So let's just get that out of the way first. Gender is a very complicated and it's even a very controversial thing anymore to discuss. So let's begin here. We are born with a sex. This can be female or male. There's also a small percentage of human beings who are born intersex, which means that they were born without the physicality of someone who would fit strictly into the binaries of female or male, right? We have to acknowledge that. Being born female, male, or intersex influences our physicality. If you're listening with kids, it's a good time to turn this off because we're using very direct language. So being born female, male, or intersex influences our physical aspects, like our physicality, right? Our physical body.
And our biology.
Yes.
Biology.
It impacts things like our genitals, our hormone levels, and our chromosomes, right? But here's the thing. It's not an either or thing. There is a spectrum. Females, generally speaking, what makes them look like a female is they tend to have more estrogen. And estrogen impacts things like our menstrual cycles, when we gain weight, where we have hair on our body, how much weight we gain, how much or how little we sleep, and so much more. But here's what's interesting. Males also have estrogen. It's just that a majority of males don't have as much as females. Males, generally speaking, have more testosterone, which impacts things like bone density, muscle mass, energy levels, and so much more than that. Where they have body hair, where they do and don't have body fat, all of this stuff. Males also have varying degrees of testosterone. Women also have testosterone, but not usually as much. But here's the thing. these hormones impact how we look, feel, and behave, but these hormone levels change all of the time. A young girl does not get her first menstrual cycle until she has a certain level of estrogen in her body, because when we were born with estrogen, and then it increases and it decreases later in our life, right? So this estrogen that makes us supposedly male or female is on a spectrum.
There's a fluidity to it.
There's a fluidity to it. It changes throughout our life. Does that mean I'm less female later on in life? I don't know. Our culture has decided no. Our culture is seemingly starting to get real strict because it's all wrapped up in politics about like there's only female and there's only male. But there is this spectrum biologically, if we're talking about hormones and body parts, right? And the fact that a small percentage of human beings are intersex, meaning they don't fit into these categories. So
well, real quick, and if you're a person of faith who believes that through the evolutionary process there is a creator and that creator is God, which I believe, then you're almost invited or even arguably compelled to look at the diversity of creation, both biologically and physically, as well, really with everything, but specifically this, because it's never just been either or.
Right.
There has always been a diversity of God's creation.
Right. And this does relate to the pastor's wife rule, so just stick with me here. So these hormone levels are arguably the things, not arguably, they are the things that make us into our cultural categories of male or female. And science recognizes intersex, meaning we don't fit, our genital physicality doesn't fit into either category.
And that's talking about sex, not gender.
Right, I'm going to get there. So what is especially interesting, these estrogen and testosterone, and there's more hormones than just that, but those are the two big ones, right? How much we work out changes our hormone levels every day, every moment. What we eat changes our hormone levels, right? So these hormone levels are the things that give us our genitals, that give us facial hair, that gives us our bone structure, that gives us our muscle mass, that gives us the thing that make us appear male or female. And yet that can change. In fact, there are some women who have higher testosterone levels naturally than some men. And there are some men who naturally have higher estrogen levels than women, right? So it gets very complicated very fast, right? So we can already see how sex and gender get really complicated. There's not always a straight line between like this is where male and female starts and ends. It's a little more messy than that. So that is all about sex, male, female, intersex, and that is based on physical traits our culture has decided. And I keep saying our culture has decided because there are a lot of cultures in the world and anthropologists study this. That is not true of every culture. Not every culture only has male and female. Some cultures have 5 different genders. Some of them don't really hold gender to any kind of standard. There is no gender. It's just like you're born and here's what it is, right?
Right.
It's not a thing. So we can all... Sex is based on physical traits like hormones, chromosomes, and our physicality. Gender, on the other hand, this is how the scientific community parcels these things because they are 2 different things. Gender is how this physicality is expressed in different cultures. Gender is culturally constructed. We are born with certain amounts of estrogen or testosterone, all these things, and then we look a certain way, and what we eat and how much we move our bodies and how we move through the world, the medication that we take impacts our hormone levels and therefore how masculine or feminine we look on our social standards. But gender is how it's expressed in different cultures. For example, in our culture, women are encouraged to wear dresses. That's an expression of gender. We wear makeup and nail polish, right? This is an expression of femininity. Again, throughout history, there have been times where men are the ones who wear dresses. There have been times where there's even species of animals where males are the more beautiful ones who kind of like dress themselves up, right?
And if you and if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what are you talking about? Especially with the male gender expressions of things in terms of men wearing dresses or things that we would deem in 2025 more feminine. Well, all you have to do
Let's go to Scotland.
is well, you could go to Scotland and see that men still wear kilts there, but also just look at some pictures of colonial days and even before that, with men who are wearing lace and stockings
And wigs.
powdered wigs. They're powdering their hair. I mean, and that's only like 250, 300 years ago. That might sound like a long time, but even in the 1800s, even in the 1800s, I mean, the church that I serve, it was built. The congregation is much older as a collective community of faith, but the building was in 1895. What men were wearing in 1895, most men today won't be caught dead in.
Yes. And again, if you're like, oh, I don't want to hear it, we get enough of this. This is part of the pastor's wife. We have to talk about this to get to complementarianism and how the pastor's wife role became a thing. So in our culture, women are encouraged to wear dresses, makeup, nail polish. They're encouraged to be more giving and kind and nurturing, right? Men, on the other hand, are encouraged to wear pants and to be strong and to be leaders, right? This is not true in all cultures. It's not universal. So it's not capital T truth if we can't see it, if it's not true all the time, right? People born with different estrogen and testosterone levels at a different time in history or a different part on the planet express that very differently, and sometimes it's even switched. Different cultures have different norms for men and women. So just as we are all born, I don't know, with like different lengths of arms, we get to decide what we do with those arms. The same should be true for how much estrogen or testosterone we are born with, or the genitals or chromosomes we are born with. If we are free, then we get to decide what to do with this physicality. Sex is about physicality, and gender is about what is done with that physicality, how we dress, what job we want, the level of education we strive for, and really just everything about our lives, right? So some people like to put people in boxes based on their physicality. So let's be really clear about this. It is beautiful if a woman desires to be a homemaker and to be home with their children. This is wonderful. It can be beautiful. There's nothing wrong with that. If you are a woman who likes dresses and likes to paint her nails and likes to get her hair done and is very feminine, great. That is beautiful. It is equally wonderful if a woman likes to wear pants and likes to go to work and she enjoys work more than spending her day cooking meals and serving her children. That is equally as beautiful and equally as wonderful. I'll even flip it. Some men these days are staying home with their children while the wife goes out and works. Also beautiful. Here's the important part. And then we're really going to go generation by generation of how this pastor's wife thing came to be. If women were born to stay at home and do domestic work and raise children, we wouldn't need to be constantly reminding them through sermons and organizations and political propaganda. If it were natural, we wouldn't be trying so hard to convince women of this in every generation. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, I do.
So it's really interesting. It's natural. This is what women were born to do. If it's what we were born to do, then why do you have to keep reminding us of it? I don't have to remind a 1-year-old that they should be learning to walk. It's what they do. They just start doing it. I don't have to keep reminding children that they need to learn how to talk. A majority of them just do it. Right? We don't need to keep reminding women that they have to be in the home. If they were meant to stay in the home, they would just do it. But a lot of us aren't just doing it because it's not our God-given talent, call, desire, whatever you want to call it, right? So back to complementarianism. You have to understand gender and sexuality to understand this complementarianism. In some more conservative Christian cultures, complementarianism is taught and even required. And the rhetoric, so it just means that men and women are complementary to each other. And again, I don't disagree with that. I think there's a lot of expressions here, and I think masculinity and femininity, and we don't have the time to get into all of that, they can complement each other, right? You need both. We need masculine energy. Masculine energy does not always belong to men, and feminine energy does not always belong to women, right? Dillon cries frequently, and that has been deemed feminine. He cries more than I do. That has been deemed feminine, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, anyway, culture and biology is a whole other conversation.
Thank you for reminding me that there's nothing wrong with that.
I think it's beautiful. So The problem with complementarianism is not entirely the definition. The problem is that the rhetoric around this belief in Christianity is that men and women complement each other and are on equal footing. But every step of the way, in practice, what it actually is women are told they have to be obedient to their husband. This is the ground that the role of the pastor's wife has grown out of, is this belief, this term complementarianism, which comes from the founders of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood in 1988 officially. For a decade or two before that, this term was being used, but it was really solidified in 1988. The founders of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which is a thing, which is really interesting. Like, we're so hung up on how men and women must behave. And I'm talking
about... certain people are.
Yes.
Certain people in
certain expressions of Christianity.
Conservative fundamentalist Christianity, which Samantha and I are not a part of, and most of the people whom are around us are not a part of, and yet at the same time, this is indeed this complementarianism, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which is even just so weird.
Yes.
These are real things,
yes,
with real people being a part of them, but also people being some people choose to be a part of this, and that's beautiful and wonderful. If that's how you see the world, I totally disagree, but if that's how you see the world, I understand it. But some people are in these communities, and they're actually Samantha has interviewed many of the women that were in these communities. Many of the communities that they were in were very, very, especially with this complementarianism and other things, very oppressive.
And even abusive to women, which we'll talk about.
Abusive and oppressive.
Yes. So in this worldview, in practice, men are seen as the family authority. I've had some small experiences with people who view the world this way. I'm going to tell a story, a really vague story. So a few years ago, there's this woman who I saw get into an argument. She started a debate with a male pastor about his church and his beliefs. And she continued to argue that women should be obedient to men and women shouldn't be pastors, and that this man's church was a problem because they ordained women. Now, I didn't want to jump into the argument, even though I really wanted to. To be clear, I do not agree with what this woman was saying at all. I wanted to jump in so badly. And what I wanted to tell this woman, but I didn't because I wasn't part of the argument, was if she really believes this, and if she really reads the Bible in this absolutist, literal, inerrant way, she should be taking 1 Timothy chapter 2 a little more seriously than. This is what gets me whenever women uphold this belief. They will go around expressing their opinions in public to men that women shouldn't be that women shouldn't be in authority over men, but they're expressing their authority over men, right? So 1 Timothy chapter 2 says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be silent, right? So these women who are upholding the Bible in this very literal way, that's not the relationship I have to the Bible, but it's interesting that they're like not even taking their own. If you've ever watched The Handmaid's Tale, they do this show, even the book does a good job at showing how some women are in positions of authority, and as long as they get to have the authority by telling other women they don't get to have authority, they're fine. But as soon as they get their fingers chopped off because they are in a position of authority or speaking their opinion to a man, now suddenly their eyes are open of like, oh, I created this oppression for myself. It's interesting how women are often the ones who keep other women in line, and they're breaking their own rules in the process. Does that make sense?
It does. And if this individual was speaking to a male pastor, presumably, is that correct?
Uh-huh.
It's also interesting that individual was not just a male or an authoritative male, but a person who was holding a specifically ordained office of the church, to which set that person on a whole other level.
Right. Again, so if you read the Bible in this way and you really believe that women shouldn't be having authority over a man, by her saying this to the male pastor, she's having authority over a man in leadership, which is the very thing she's contradicting herself in the process. She was certainly not silent. So just a really quick disclaimer for me, I do not read the Bible this way.
Nor do I.
The Bible is a collection of people's experiences with the divine throughout thousands of years of history. People from real times with real cultures and real societies, and it is more complicated than reading it and deciding that everything that it says can simply be laid over our own culture and time. It has to be wrestled with. That's the whole point. Israel, by the way, means to wrestle with God. Israel is called to be God's people. So God's people are called to wrestle with God, which means God, as God is portrayed in the Bible, is called to be wrestled with. That's the whole point of Christianity.
And just to throw another little thing in here, a specific, I can't say that word today. Specifically in the New Testament, with a lot of Paul's authentic letters, you will see Paul is not. Now there are some letters that are general or kind of universal. They're the smaller ones. There are those. I'm not saying there aren't, but most of Paul's letters, many of them that we put much emphasis on, both for right and wrong. Paul was writing to specific communities about concerns and issues. When you hear a passage from 1st or 2nd Corinthians or to Romans or Galatians, he was writing to specific church communities in a specific place, in a specific time, with a specific culture. He was not writing universally forever for 2,000 years later that specific culture that you had to do that. That's not what that is. That is totally taking that historical, those historical books, those historical passages, and misreading them totally. And
well, I also want to say one more thing about gender and sex, and how we like to split this like biology versus culture thing, but there is no splitting. Dillon and I were just talking about this morning. We can't split these things. Culture and biology are intertwined. We know that. Look into epigenetics. We know that the culture that we live in actually impacts our biology. These things can't be intertwined. I study culture for a living. I'm pretty obsessed with this. Just go in a toy aisle and look at how now Barnes & Noble does a good job at not gendering toys. The toys are gendered. One half is girls, one half is boys, which is wild. It's 2025 and stores are still doing this, which means people are fine with it, I guess. I don't know. But the messaging is relentless. So if you think about the messaging that we get from culture about how little girls should take care of babies from the time they're 2, they have baby dolls. Even earlier than that, they have baby dolls, which is fine. Again, our girls have baby dolls. My 4-year-old is everything that I wasn't as a child. I was not a baby doll nurturing child. My 4-year-old came out. Her favorite color is pink. She wants to wear tutus. She wants to be a mommy when she grows up. She regularly tells me
that's beautiful.
She can't wait to have a baby in her belly. That is so far removed from who I was. So she has come to teach me that, like, femininity is important.
And yet at the same
wonderful.
And yet at the same time, our 2-year-old, she is also very feminine, and yet she loves
pink, but she loves cars.
But she also loves Spider-Man.
Yes.
And so she has a Spider-Man electric toothbrush. And she
wants a Spider-Man bike.
And she wants a Spider-Man bike. Here's the thing. That is so beautiful. I love that Sophia loves Spider-Man. So my brother growing up, his favorite superhero was Spider-Man. Except that a lot of those superhero movies and stuff, it's like, oh well, boys like that. Mm-hmm. No, that is not true. That is not true.
And our culture is more comfortable. You can tell this is something we care a lot about. Yeah. Our culture would be more comfortable if our daughter dressed up like Spider-Man than if somebody's son dressed up like a princess.
Oh, yeah.
Which shows that we are more comfortable with females being masculine than we are with males being feminine.
Correct.
Which shows you what our culture thinks about femininity.
And what they think about masculinity.
Yeah, so we get this messaging in our culture, but imagine a girl growing up in a complementarianism church with complementarianism theology, where you are told your father
rules the roost.
There you go, rules the roost.
Sits on the throne,
yes. Dad is king, husband is king, right? Like, you're always going to be under male authority. And I think what's even more so heartbreaking to me is some little girls. Again, I didn't get this messaging in my family directly that there were positions I couldn't hold because I was a girl. Part of that is because I grew up with 90s feminism too, where like the huge thing for girls was like, you can be anything. I was almost taught to be masculine, and that's a whole other episode. But I think about little girls already. I think about my daughters growing up in this culture, but then I think about how little girls are growing up in churches, and then I think about how some little girls don't just have churches teaching them this, their families are teaching them this. So this messaging is so strong. Just a really quick story. A female pastor that Dillon and I know, she told us a story about how she had little kids and she was teaching them confirmation or Sunday school or something.
Confirmation. I was hoping that you'd tell this story.
I love this story. And we might have told this on an episode, I can't remember.
I don't think we did.
A male pastor came in to teach for the day, and they were like under this table playing, and they got kind of scared. They were hiding, and the female pastor said, "Hey, what's wrong?" And they go over to her and they said, "We didn't know boys could be pastors."
Isn't that great?
Which I love, because again, this is not the only way. Like, right?
The beauty, if you, it's a beauty to me. It's a beauty to Samantha. It's a beauty to tens of thousands of other people. But I did not have this growing up, but there are many children, arguably for the past at least 20 to 30 years, 25 to 30 years, I'd say, even though, again, the Lutheran Church was ordaining women in 1970, beginning in the year 1970. It took, some time for more women to be ordained and to go be pastors in parish churches. And yet, at the same time, there are some kids that have grown up not knowing any difference. They have only had women pastors.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole generation out there, which is so beautiful to me, that know that both women and men can be pastors, or most of their experience was of a woman pastor. Yeah. The first time that I experienced a woman pastor was in 2015. In 2015 was the first time that I ever experienced...
So you were, 14 years old or something? 13?
No, 2015?
Yeah.
I was 14 years old in 2015?
Yeah.
How old do you think I am?
2000. Oh, my math. 24, 25?
You're thinking maybe like
2005.
Okay, yeah. No, those are two very different things.
Okay.
I was out of college.
Oh, that's interesting.
I knew that there were women pastors. I knew that. I even supported it. But the first time that I actually experienced a woman preaching and leading a worship service, I was out of college.
That's interesting. I was
out of college.
I was in 8th grade, and I went to a Lutheran church with some of my friends because I slept over at their house, and the next day they had this church thing, so I went with them, and it was a female pastor.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up going to church, but female pastors are something that was not super weird to me.
Oh, it wasn't weird to me. I knew about it. I knew that my friends had they had, but I didn't grow up in a church that ever had a woman pastor. Yeah. So, it's interesting.
We had to talk about gender so we could talk about complementarianism, because there is no strong pastor's wife role without this complementarianism kind of thing, at least not as we know it today. So I just want to do one more kind of drop the mic moment. The messaging about male pastors is so strong that many believe it's always been this way, but that is absolutely wrong. In early Christianity, women were priests. And I'm not going to get into that because that's not what this episode is about. This is about pastors' wives. But there are countless books. Maybe we'll do an episode on it whenever we do ordination. But women were absolutely priests. That's not debated. That is
that's
hard
a historic fact.
In the earliest forms of Christianity, women were priests. Okay, so history of the pastor's wife. Oh, that was an hour setup for how did this happen. So let's jump into the history. When communities of Jesus followers were unified by the Roman Empire and then Roman Catholicism came onto the scene, many priests were married by that point, right? Because this was a couple hundred years after Jesus died. People were realizing, Jesus isn't coming back in our generation, so we might as well have a life, right?
We might as well get married.
Let's get married. Let's have children, right?
Have
So
relationships.
many priests were getting married. So even Roman Catholicism, this celibacy thing, that didn't happen until the 11th century medieval reforms. So we had to talk about priests and celibacy to start talking about how we got this pastor's wife role. So During the 11th century medieval reforms, there was a push towards celibacy for priests. So in the early 1100s then, the priests' marriages were no longer recognized, which is actually kind of sad, right? Because some priests were married and their marriages were no longer recognized. And I don't think that was an entirely overnight thing. There was talk about how that was coming and the fallout of that is a whole other episode as well. But what's interesting, of course, as we unfortunately know in terrible ways now, many of these priests did not stop having sexual relationships.
Correct.
And these relationships, now some of them were very
these now celibate priests.
Yes, these
quote,
celibate priests, they continued to have, many of them, long-term relationships with women who just couldn't legally or spiritually, religiously be considered their wives, right? But they would have these long-term relationships and subsequent children from these relationships. But these relationships and these children were not seen as legitimate by the church, and they were therefore kept secret. But it's something that everybody kind of knew about it. In fact, there's parts of like London and there's different parts of the world where if you go there, there are these kind of hidden away corner secret cemeteries where these women were buried because they were not able to be buried properly in the church cemeteries, and sometimes children as well. And I think it's like about 1% of these bodies have been pulled up, and Dillon and I talked about this today too. The practice of taking dead bodies out of the ground to learn something and to study them is so disgusting to me. I read a couple years ago, so indigenous people, Native Americans, indigenous people, us white people came over and took their land in the United States of America. We took their land, and we started later on wanting to study indigenous people.
We also uprooted some of their dead.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We uprooted their dead bodies whenever their ancestors are still living. In fact, there are more indigenous bones in... Just think about this. There are more bones of indigenous people in the United States of America. There are more bones of indigenous people in museums than there are still in the ground. That's how many bodies we have dug up.
Well, I'd like
to study them. That's crazy. Let the dead rest and let their ancestors have a place to go visit. That is so crazy to me.
Yeah, I'm all for archaeology and the study of ancient things if we find the bones, but when we go looking for them and disturbing the graves of the dead, and we're actively trying to take over cultures that have been in the minority, that I do also agree that is heinous,
unethical, yeah.
Heinous behavior.
So all that is to say, there were these secret cemeteries where these women were buried, and some of their bones were pulled up, and a lot of them had syphilis, which during the medieval time was very common.
Unfortunately common.
But in this context, these priests who were supposed to be celibate but were still having these long-term relationships with women who couldn't marry them, they were known as concubines. Now, this word concubine has meant a lot of things throughout history, but in this specific medieval context, these women, who were for all intents and purposes, many of them wives, just without the paperwork, to these men. And I don't want to scandalize it too much, because some of it might have been scandalous, some of it might have just been priests sleeping with a lot of women, but I also can only imagine, in fact, I know for sure, but I don't know the numbers. I can only imagine that a lot of these priests, they wanted to be active in the Catholic Church. Priesthood was the only way to do that. But they loved this woman. So they continued to have a relationship with her. And they would even pay her because this woman would be pregnant and have the priest's child, but it had to be a secret. So the priest would give the woman money. So to the eyes of a historian, it often looks like prostitution, which is why they became known as concubines, because priests were paying these women and sleeping with them. But really, in a lot of instances, these priests they loved this woman, but they weren't allowed to marry this woman.
Well, and hopefully they would have loved the child, too, and would have cared for them through a monetary...
So financially we're giving money, right. We see this with kings throughout history as well. Yes. So there was scandal there for sure, but there was also just this genuine, like, I want to be a priest, but there's this celibate rule, but I also love this woman, and I'm sleeping with her, and she got pregnant, and now there's a family. All I can do is give my money. That's the only way I can support. And then they were buried in secret in these, like, corners of town. Just this crazy stuff. So during reforms, so again, these women were known as concubines. They were women in long-term relationships with priests, but not recognized as wives. So during reforms, instead of a woman being a priest's concubine, they became which is another way to say the priest's whore, is what they were often called, right? Because it was the secret, and yet it was also, everybody knew it. And I also want to be clear, because I don't want to be anti-Catholic, I'm actually not against celibacy. Although I do recognize the harm that it's done. I think that our whole culture has a problem with sexuality that needs to be healed. But I'm not I understand celibacy at some level. I'm not totally against it.
I am not against celibacy either. I understand it. I personally could not do that, and yet at the same time, what my problem with celibacy, religious celibacy, is, especially in the priesthood. No, not just suppression, although yes, that comes with it. It is that the celibacy is a requirement. It's a requirement. In order to be a priest, you must remain celibate. Okay, well, maybe some people would remain celibate. There's a lot of people. I mean, there's people in the Lutheran Church that are celibate pastors, both men and women. They're not married. They have no children. Mm-hmm. They're celibate. That voluntarily. So, my problem is not with celibacy. My problem is with compulsory celibacy.
Yes.
And someone would argue, well, no one's forcing you into that. You volunteer by going in, you have the call, and you voluntarily know that you have to practice celibacy. Okay, yes, I understand that, and yet still it's compulsory.
What's interesting is whenever men have to be celibate, there are a lot of scandals because they just can't help themselves. Even if love is involved, they just can't help themselves. They sleep with women. These women have kids. These kids are not... It creates a social problem. And yet, by the same numbers, we have nuns who are celibate and they don't become pregnant, and they are not abusing their power through sexuality with people who have less power. Fully. Not to the numbers. Not nearly to the numbers. I know that there's a few scandals that we could point to, but not nearly to the numbers as men who have to be celibate. No, I mean, not even comparable numbers.
No, I know.
So, I think that's really interesting. Again, it points back to, we have a problem with how male authority is seen. When you give a man unlimited power, they will use it. And I think, power is an addiction. And I think that is what's all wrapped up in this pastor's wife conversation. Yeah. So, during reforms, this is the really interesting part. If you've hung in this long, this is the really interesting part. During reforms, during the medieval time, Protestant Reformation was on the scene, right? All this stuff is kind of colliding. Instead of a woman being a priest's concubine or a priest's whore, you had these priests or these people who wanted to be pastors, but they weren't celibate anymore because Protestant Reformation was really coming on. So these new churches coming onto the scene, and the women would become the pastor's wife. But here's what happened is the priest lost his masculine authority as the supposedly celibate priest, and now had authority as a husband and a father. So they still maintained this authority, but they weren't celibate anymore. So now they had power as a husband and a father over their children and over their wife. But during this time when the Catholic Church was struggling to keep power because of the Protestant Reformation and humanism and all of these things, right? Becoming a pastor's wife was a real risk because many people who were aligning against the Catholic Church at this time, and they became married pastors of Reformed churches, they were being imprisoned and killed. So being a pastor's wife was more dangerous than being a priest's concubine, right?
Yeah, isn't that wild?
So interesting. So it was a dangerous choice to marry a pastor, but you became a pastor's wife. But because you had this whole thing, this secret that was out in the open that everybody knew, where it was a priest's concubine, they were often called priest whores. When you married a pastor, you weren't called a pastor's wife, you were called a pastor's whore. So what the Reformed churches started doing was to make the pastor's wife a legitimate role, to make it a respectable thing to do to marry a pastor, to kind of break free from this priest concubine kind of, or a priest whore, right? to kind of get rid of the scandal of it. Does that make sense the way I described it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just want to make mention to this for people who are listening. Obviously, once again, Samantha and I are Lutheran, and I'm a Lutheran pastor. And one of the governing documents or books or confessions, I should say, is called the Book of Concord. In the Lutheran Church, and it's outlines the confessions and the teachings of the Lutheran Church. And it's interesting, there's something called the Augsburg Confession, to which I am called to uphold as a Lutheran pastor. And one of the articles in
it's
there...
It's almost like a Hippocratic oth.
Yeah, so it's almost like a Hippocratic oath that the doctor takes, but this is for pastors. And it's interesting that one of the articles in the Augsburg Confession, one of the confessions of the Lutheran Church, talks about concerning married priests. And it's right here, and it's outlined for us that when we become a Protestant...
I'm laughing because Dillon has this book open and he highlighted this section and he has an arrow pointing to it and it says, "Thank God," with 3 exclamation points about... marriage and priests. Right.
So it's interesting. So during the Protestant Reformation, one of the biggest things, and this was one of the biggest. People actually thought that many of the Protestants were absolute heretics because they had totally lost this understanding, which came in the 11th century with celibacy, and they just thought forever priests were celibate,
which is not true.
Which is not true. And so this idea that they would go back to allowing married priests. Or married pastors in the Protestant Reformation was one of the biggest scandals, and so I am called as a Lutheran pastor to uphold an actual official article in my church that yes, indeed, pastors can and may and should be married if they choose.
Right.
So it's so interesting.
Well,
the almost counter.
Yes, but here's where there's like this flip that happens, right? So this role of a pastor's wife becomes legitimate because they don't want them to be seen as the Catholic priest's concubines or whores during the medieval time. But then it kind of flips, right? Because, well, let's just talk about Martin Luther quick. So in the 1500s then, so I want to make that point. It flips because the Protestant churches from the very beginning were created with the understanding that the pastor would be married and the pastor's wife, not the pastor's whore anymore, but the wife would have an official job in the church. So people were hiring a pastor.
And would most likely have children.
Yes. But this pastor would come along with a wife. So the Protestant pastor's job from its origins was created with 2 people doing the job of the pastor. So the pastor and the pastor's wife. And you can still see that today, even in our Lutheran church. Yeah. The church is set up in a way that 2 people, a pastor and a pastor's wife, are doing the job of a pastor. But what has happened is you get people like me who are like, I'm not doing that, right? So now you have the pastor like Dillon expected to do the job that was created for 2 people. And that's interesting. That's really interesting. And we still have this church built off the back of the unpaid labor of a woman called a pastor's wife. So you see this flip. And then in the 1500s, where like the real Protestant Reformation, right? So all this was happening like leading up to the Reformation during this time of like there were other churches and pastors were becoming not celibate, and there was like it all blurs together. There's no clear line. But in the 1500s, Protestant Reformation was in full swing. Martin Luther got married. And his wife, Katharina von Bora, what a fancy name, right? A fancy woman. She can also be seen as modeling this kind of ministry. And the word ministry, don't get me started, but this ministry partner. This is certainly not the only origin story of a Protestant pastor's wife being expected to support their husband's pastor job. But again, in the origin story of the Protestant Reformation, again, you have it. This Katharina von Bora, Martin Luther's wife, was very much doing the job of a pastor's wife in a lot of ways.
But Katharina was interesting because Martin Luther...
Is it Katarina or Katharina?
Katharina.
Really?
Yeah.
I've heard it both ways.
I'm sure
I've also heard her called Catherine.
Well, sure, that's the English version,
right.
But she was German.
Okay, go ahead.
Interestingly enough, is Martin Luther was an ordained Roman Catholic priest in the Augustinian order. He was a monastic priest.
Right.
He was a priest of the Roman Catholic Church in a specific religious order, the Augustinians.
And he didn't get married till after he got kicked out. He didn't want to start a new church.
Absolutely.
He was Catholic through and through.
He was Catholic
then
through and
they
through.
excommunicated him, and they even called him an outlaw, meaning he could be killed. They wanted to kill him. They searched for him. He didn't get married until after it was clear, oh, I'm not a priest anymore.
Martin Luther never once renounced that he was not a Catholic. He never said that he wasn't a Catholic, which is very interesting. It was the church that got rid of him, not him getting rid of the church.
Yeah.
He wanted to reform the church from within and stick with it, and they didn't want him. Mm-hmm. So, but it's interesting that Catherine von Bora, who became Luther's wife, was also a woman who was in a religious order. She was a nun.
Right.
So when you talk about, I know you hate this, but when you talk about a ministry, she had a call to ministry as a nun from the very, not beginning, but from the part of her life. She had a ministry calling in her own, or a vocation. I actually like vocation better than ministry.
Yeah, me too.
But she had a vocation of her own to be in a religious order. And during this time, a priest and a nun is what started not only the Protestant Reformation, a priest and a nun coming together, getting married, they had children, and Lutherans in particular, their very beginning starts with a priest and a nun getting married.
Oh, yeah. I never thought of it that way. That's so funny.
Yeah.
That's good. So by the 19th and 20th centuries, the evangelical and mainline Protestant churches, the pastor's wife role really became sort of really institutionalized. She was expected to teach, to play the piano or organ, to lead women's groups. It became an unpaid staff position, to make bulletins, right? So the question is the pastor's wife a person or a position? Well, throughout history, in certain strands of Christianity, including ours, there was a time
Yes, there was.
in Lutheranism, in mainline Protestantism, where the pastor's wife, I'll even say this, there are some, not Lutheran, but there are still many, many churches where if a man wants to be a pastor, his wife is also interviewed. And there are stories, countless stories, of if a woman is interviewed and says anything that, like, she believes, quote, incorrectly, unquote, right? Or she says the wrong thing, or she's not, like, meek enough or subordinate enough, or all these things, they will not hire the husband, or the husband has been fired because of what the pastor's wife has said. Not even in the church, but just like in her profession.
And yet that is not going on. That is not going on factually in mainline Protestant denominations.
Right. There was no reality where I would have been interviewed for you to be
There
a
is
pastor.
no reality.
A thing. We wouldn't have done that. That's crazy.
That there's not even a process for that.
Right. So there is a book that Beth Allison Barr just wrote. She's a professor at Baylor University. She's also a pastor's wife in the Southern Baptist Convention. And she wrote a book about the history of this pastor's wife and how that, for a lot of women, if you wanted to work in ministry, if you wanted to work in the church, that was your only choice. So you marry a pastor and boom, now you get to do it. Unpaid, no titles, but there you are. So let's just talk about some interesting stories. In Protestantism, the pastor's job was historically, like we said, and literally created to be a two-person job. So the church, if you're a Protestant, meaning if you're anything that's not Catholic or Orthodox, then you go to a church that was set up from its origins for the pastor to actually be the pastor and a pastor's wife. The church has relied on the unpaid labor of a woman, of a pastor's wife. Historically, the pastor's wives have been expected to do a lot of things. Some of them I already talked about, but also to create the bulletins, to host events, to teach Sunday school, to play piano, to organize vacation Bible school. Some pastors' wives will even share the pulpit with their pastor husbands. What are some other things? To do counseling with their husbands, right? To sit alongside their husbands and do counseling.
Especially if they're doing couples counseling, or if they're it's a male pastor, but a woman is seeking pastoral counseling. The wife would usually sit in on that.
Yes.
So there's that. But
But
again,
they weren't paid and they weren't given the
and
title.
again, I keep always going back to this, and I know it means nothing to some people. They were allowed to do some of these small vocational things as the pastor's wife,
Just like
which
the
was
deacon.
which was unpaid, but they were doing the absolute, almost exact definition of what the early church deacon is.
Which is why a
is-
deacon, in a lot of senses, is undermined now, which
Correct.
is not right, because
Correct.
it's been deemed feminine.
And the office of deacon is a powerful office of the church, to which is needed. It is, if people like the word biblical, it's biblical. And the other thing is, what's so interesting is, I always go back to this, and I said it before, and I'll say it again. However, they were allowed to do these small unpaid things as the pastor's wife, but they were never, and arguably still never in most denominations, to administer the sacraments.
Mm-hmm.
They could not touch the baptismal water, and they could not touch the bread and wine.
Yeah. Well, there's a story in Dr. Barr's book about a wife and a husband. They both went to seminary and they wanted to do ministry together. And that's not super uncommon in the history of the church and even present day church, where two people, sometimes spouses, but sometimes just friends. Some churches have 2 or 3 pastors. Some pastors work really well together, so they want to go get hired together somewhere else. Sometimes there's teams that get hired together, right? So many churches that have 2 or more pastors, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention, is that common for Baptists to have 2 pastors? Because I feel like I hear a lot of stories.
Well, usually those churches are large. There's not.
Right,
There's
right,
not.
right.
There's a lot
They're not
of.
small.
There's a lot of people, but there's not a lot of
So you need more pastors.
congregations.
So Dr. Barr tells a story in her book about pastors' wives. Again, she's a medieval historian, so she really focuses on that time period. But she talks about this couple that, I think she interviewed them, but they, or maybe she found them in the archives, I can't remember, but they went to seminary together and they wanted to do ministry together. They went to seminary together, they got ordained together, right? Because historically in the Southern Baptist Convention, the Southern Baptists as a whole were against women getting ordained, but specific churches could ordain if they wanted to. So some women were getting ordained, but then some churches didn't like that. Like you could get ordained, but overall it wasn't accepted. It created a lot of problems for a woman to be ordained.
Well, and for our listening audience, the interesting thing about denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention and many other
We're not picking on them. There's a lot of them.
no. This is actually, I'm just stating a fact. There's nothing wrong with this. But something that is interesting about those denominations that are Baptist or more evangelical or congregational or whatever is the denomination does not have the authority to nationally ordain people. The individual congregation has the authority and the power to ordain people. So one congregation in the Southern Baptist Convention, although they're all a part of that denomination, one congregation could ordain a woman, let's say in one town, and then you go over 3 towns over and it's the same Southern Baptist church, and yet they're not going to ordain you because their ordinations are local ordinations. They're not national ordinations. As a Lutheran pastor, I am ordained by the national church.
Yeah.
I can go all throughout the country to any Lutheran church
And be qualified.
It's not like, I'm in the town of Tamaqua. If I want to go down to Allentown, which is a bigger metropolitan area, they don't recognize my ordination. I'm nationally ordained.
Right. Well, Dr. Barr tells a lot of stories. One of the stories is there's a woman who got ordained, and then she was just looking for a church to go to, not to be the pastor of the church, but she told the pastor, she said, I'm just looking for a church. I'm looking for a community. I do want you to know that I'm ordained, but I'm not looking to stir up any trouble. I just want a church. And he said, you're not welcome here.
Right.
Not even as a pastor, just as a member, just to walk into the doors, you are not welcome here, because she was a woman with ordination. Dr. Barr also tells a story in her book about, which is an excellent book if you're interested in all this, but so there's this couple, they went to seminary together, they wanted to do ministry together. Many churches have 2 or more pastors, and those pastors are hired together and they pastor together. They interviewed together at a church, Southern Baptist Convention, I'm pretty sure. They interviewed together at a church, and the church agreed to hire them. And they were like, oh, this is great. And then they got the paperwork, and the paperwork had him listed as the pastor and had her listed as the pastor's family. They gave him a title and salary, but categorized her as the pastor's family. And when she pushed it, they said, it's fine, you can still do the work, you're just going to do it under your husband. And she said, you have two choices. You can either list me as a co-pastor with my husband equally, or you can take me off that paperwork entirely. And they took her off the paperwork entirely. Because they're fine with her doing the work.
But
they're
not going to give her a title.
Fine with giving her the title.
And the pay.
Or the pay. And that is the common thread. Churches who do not ordain women, but uphold this pastor's wife role, they are typically fine with a woman doing that work, but they will not pay you for it. Then you also have the opposite is true. They won't even let women teach teenage boys. Like, they won't even let women teach.
If you get into some denominations that are very that are not just conservative or evangelical, but fundamentalist, you can't even teach. Some really small minorities, but you can't even teach
the pastor's wife.
You can't even teach children.
Right, you can't have authority over anybody. So let's just talk about some things that are crazy to me that I've learned about pastors' wives. There are manuals for pastors' wives. I have never and will never read them, but something interesting about these manuals, because Dr. Barr talked about it in her book, was
your birthday's coming up. I might.
Okay, so some of these manuals will say things like it's about your heart. It's not about what you look like. And then they will proceed to have an entire chapter in this manual about how to dress and how to do your makeup and how you need to dress well as a pastor's wife, which is so interesting. So there are actual manuals for pastors' wives. We are not making it up that like a pastor's wife is an official role. At some churches, they take this role, this unpaid role without an official title on the paperwork, as a legit thing. You have to show up. You can't skip. You have work to do. I heard a story about a woman, an older woman was making bulletins, and somebody came in and asked her, like, oh, why are you... So her husband was retired, and she was still making the bulletins. And they said, why are you still making the bulletins? Your husband's retired. Why do you still show up every week to make the bulletins? And she said, oh, the new pastor isn't married yet. I figured I'd keep doing this until he's married. Which is wild. That means that this woman who isn't even, like, he's not even dating anyone, but this supposed future wife of his already has a job lined up for her just because she marries him. That's insanity. That is crazy to me. Another thing, so in the Southern Baptist denomination, some male pastors married to ordained women who were doing mission work or church planting work were threatened and told that the man wouldn't be paid if they didn't put a stop to their wife doing this work.
Ordained work in particular.
Yes. So male ordained pastors were punished because their wives became ordained or were working towards ordination, which is crazy. Again, this is still happening. There have even been seminaries that offer scholarships to pastors' wives or wives of men who are actively in seminary to teach them how to support their husband. The Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary gave scholarships to wives of male students preparing for ministry. And they were, this is a quote, they were taught to, quote, know their husband's craft.
Oh.
They were taught...
Where is this?
Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Are they still operating?
I believe so.
Oh.
This was, I think, in the 70s or 80s. They were given a scholarship by two people predominant in the evangelical Baptist kind of world. I forget their names already, but so interesting. These pastors' wives were taught in seminars and in classes how to pack their husband's suitcase when he had to go away for a weekend, how to make meals for a large number of people at any moment. They were taught, and some of them even had to sign contracts and paperwork saying they would agree to this. They lived in the parsonage, and they had to have food available so they could make a large meal at any time, but they also had to have their living area ready for guests at any time. Dylan's like rolling his eyes. It's crazy to me, right? So, and this is like legit bureaucratic. Sign this paper. You're agreeing to this. The woman is being interviewed. If the woman
We should,
ever,
you and I should make a wheel chart to have our house ready at all times.
could you imagine? There's also a story in Dr. Barr's book. Dylan and I talked about this morning because it's so heartbreaking. So, Dr. Barr said that, I think she said that her husband did a lot of the cleaning because she is at a research university. She's at Baylor University. She has a PhD. She's working and they have kids, all these things. A kid, I think. They have one kid, I can't remember. But this younger woman who had just had her second child, was married to a pastor, came over to her house and saw her house really clean and was like really upset about the fact that it was so clean, because here she is, she has 2 kids and she is struggling to keep her house clean, even though she's supposed to for the church and to like have company and all these things. She has postpartum depression and nobody can help her through it because of these pastors' wives' expectations, where she just had a second baby and she went on to have more babies, but she was just struggling because people couldn't see the humanity in a mother or a woman or a pastor's wife of like, yeah, they are not just show ponies ready to serve you at any moment and to pack and unpack your suitcase and make you meals for 15 people on a random Tuesday afternoon. She just had a baby. It's insanity. It's so crazy to me. There's also horrifying stories, countless of them, of women being burned, punched, abused, physically abused by their husbands, their pastor husbands. And when they ask for a divorce, they are told no. Or on the rare occasion where they are told yes, their husband keeps their job and there's no repercussions, and the woman is not allowed in the church anymore. So the man, the pastor who did the abusing of the wife, is fine. He gets to keep his ordination. He gets to remain in the church. He gets to remain in leadership. But the woman who was abused and initiated divorce because of the abuse, she's no longer welcome in the church. She is not allowed back in. That's crazy. That is backwards, right?
That's like, immoral.
Take care of the widow. Take care of, like, you know, not that she's a widow, but she was abused. She might as well be. I mean, what other choice do you have? Crazy. So if this pastor's wife supporting her husband and being under his authority is kind of foreign to you, like it is to me, just know that this is not just a church thing. I feel like sometimes, and we should, church should be held to a standard, right? But we've witnessed this everywhere, right? Like most of us have witnessed this kind of dynamic where the man, how did you say it? Rules the roost and
sits on the throne.
We have witnessed this in parents or friends or in our own lives. We witness it everywhere, right? Like men have a majority of the leadership roles, even in like schools are predominantly, teachers have historically been women, and yet principals and superintendents have historically been men, right? We see men on the top of the pyramid all of the time. So it's not just the church. It is a church thing. That's what Dylan and I study and are interested in. But this is a cultural problem.
It's also, I don't know if you're going to bring this up because we're coming towards the end here, but this dynamic of pastor and pastor's wife and those two roles working together is also very, very much, before I was a pastor, I worked at a college for a while, but before then I worked in government for a short time, and I really enjoyed that work. But one of the things that I saw while in government was a lot of male politicians who were obviously married to women, and the role of the male politician and the male politician's wife, I see many overlaps, correlations between the male
politics in the church has so many overlaps.
Male politician, male politician's wife, and also pastor and pastor's wife.
Male pastor, yeah.
Male pastor and pastor's wife. It is not just, this isn't to take it away from the church, but this is not just in the church. This has been a very much a thing in American politics in particular. Well, in all politics, but American politics in particular, and it's starting to unravel or dissipate somewhat. But in some of these more fundamentalist and conservative Christian groups, which I always like to say we are not a part of. And yet
we are the legacy of it a little bit.
There is some legacy
there.
here that we have to admit, we have to talk about, and
yeah. I have so many thoughts about that, but I don't want to get too off topic. Wait, I had something to say and I'm losing it.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We were talking about how most of us have witnessed it in cultures. I don't know. I lost it. It's all right. So I can't tell you how many times when Dillon and I work the same number of hours every week. We are sometimes standing next to each other with our children, and people look to me and ask about their childcare, or people, if the girls are dressed up for some reason, they'll look at me and be like, oh, mom dressed you really well. And oftentimes, if it's the truth, which about half the time it is, I'll say, no, dad dressed them, right? We're both in our home. We both dress our kids. We both, like, people will look at me and be like, oh, what'd they have for breakfast? Oh, what are you making for dinner, right? There's these micro things. And that's often outside of church. These are the assumptions that we all make about division of labor based on gender, and we often assume that the woman is the one doing certain work. And that's not just a socially conservative church thing, that's a cultural thing, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it's starting to break down, which I do love.
Yeah, I love that.
But I still experience it often.
I love that it's breaking down, and I love that it's dissipating. And yet it's so interesting because many people will say, and there is a truth to this, so I'm not disagreeing with them, but many people will say, well, I don't really want to be a part of a church community or be a part of religion or anything because they promote things that that I just don't agree with culturally and ethically or whatever. And that's a person's personal opinion. That's fine. And there could be some truth to that, specifically in more conservative or fundamentalist Christian churches. And yet, at the same time, we know people, and we have some acquaintances that they are not religious people at all. They belong to no church. They're members of no church. They're definitely not religious. Arguably, they're not even very spiritual, and yet they have some of these very kind of clear cultural understandings that are actually very sexist. And they're not getting that from religion. So they didn't grow up with religion. Yeah. They're not a part of a religious community. Mm-hmm. So this is even seen in, and you could look at it and it all overlaps and mixes through, but this is even seen in more, I hate to use these separations, but this is even seen in more, sometimes even secular or humanist understandings of the world.
And there's nothing wrong with gendered roles if both or all of the parties involved are good with it. What I'll say about some of the couples that I see where it's the woman taking on a lot of the cooking and cleaning and childcare and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of quiet resentment going on there.
Yep.
I hear a lot of, I do everything around here. I hear a lot of that from people who claim to be fine with the arrangement. And I think that's really telling as well. Meanwhile, the man is fine. I also hear a lot in these gendered arrangements. I hear a lot of rhetoric from the man being like, oh, you worry too much. Just calm down. Yeah, because she's the one holding it all together here. You come home to dinner made and a child with a fresh diaper who's taking a nap. Must be nice to be able to be that calm and not anxious.
Well,
right?
and it's so interesting.
It's not working.
And it's so interesting because it is clearly parts of the culture outside of just specifically religious culture that are still propelling and maintaining this, because some of these individuals that we have acquaintances with who are wonderful, lovely people, wonderful couples, and their children are great, and yada yada, on and on. They're not going every week to a church service having to learn about their roles.
And complementarianism.
Right. I mean, they are actually far from that. Right. And yet, are still... So
yes, what we're trying to say is the church does not exist outside of culture. Right. Culture has influenced church from the beginning. These things are happening in the church and outside of the church and in the military and in capitalism, in businesses, right? Like this thing is everywhere. You can examine it everywhere. But specifically, the pastor's wife role has a lot to do with gender and complementarianism. And let's just conclude by saying I don't like this phrase, pastor's wife. But I will say, here's what I will say about it. I can't deny that it is a very specific experience to be married to a pastor. There is a pastor's wife experience. I'd be curious to hear like a gay woman's path. Like if you're a pastor and you're a gay woman and you have a wife, I'd be curious to hear about that experience and what that is like and how it's different and similar, because that's interesting. But to be a pastor's wife, I don't like that term for myself. If anybody ever calls me that, I mean, I'm not going to be like, no, whatever, because I am. Just like you're a professor's husband, right? But it is a very specific experience being married to a pastor. There's this really blurred line between personal life and professional life when you're a pastor, but also whenever you're married to a pastor. So Dillon is a pastor. Me and our children go to church where my husband, their father, is the pastor. I'm also a professor and an author, so I have my own job and responsibilities. So I kind of benefit, I think, if anything, in our context from being your spouse, because there's a lot of jobs where kids could not go. But on the semesters where I teach night classes, sometimes the girls have to go to meetings with Dillon in the evening. And in our church, that's a non-issue. He just takes our kids to his meetings and it's not a thing, right? Sometimes Dillon and I, this is a really blurred line, I serve on some committees. I would serve on those committees even if Dillon wasn't a pastor. And honestly, we'd probably, if he was just a regular person in the church, I'm pretty sure that him and I would serve on those committees together.
Yeah.
But now he goes to some committee meetings as a pastor and I'm there as a member. So we get to go together. Again, that's just these blurred lines of what our culture has previously put into boxes. Like, here's your work box, here's your family box. Being married to a pastor, being a, quote, pastor's wife, also our kids being pastor's kids, there's this really blurred line. Like, our kids have been practicing for communion with water at home. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. There's this blurred line. Sometimes all four of us are in meetings while other kids are running around, right? I teach the high school and young adult class because I like that. I like 15 to 22-ish year olds. That's my jam. It's my favorite age. It's why I'm a professor. Dillon teaches confirmation classes, and sometimes Dillon and I will join our classes for a lesson or to plan an event. And it's tricky to figure out, are we doing this because we both teach the older two classes at church, or are we doing this because we're married and we talk about some of this stuff at home and have ideas? I don't know. A little bit of both.
I think there's general overlap. Yeah.
But if I wasn't your wife teaching that class, that probably wouldn't happen. So again, I can't deny that there is an experience and there are certain opportunities that I get at the church because I'm married to you,
Sure.
like doing a class with you, which if anybody wanted to, they could, but because they don't live with you and talk about it, they don't. I will say that when Dillon and I do church stuff together, it never feels to me like I'm doing the job of a pastor's wife or I'm under his authority or that people expect it of me. Also, I want to say that if I wasn't married to a pastor, I'd actually do more in the church. I would love to sit on council, but as long as Dillon is the pastor, which is probably going to be for the rest of our lives, I will never do that. First of all, I don't think it's ethical. I don't even know if it's allowed, but if it wasn't allowed, I wouldn't do it because I think that would really blur the lines for me of like, wait, like council is officially Dillon's boss, sort of. I can't, that just really messes with my head. I wouldn't know. I'd be afraid to open my mouth.
Well, that would mean that you're the boss. I always have this. I'll end on this. But I always have this this slight joke. Let's say Samantha were to go to seminary, right? And Samantha were to be an ordained pastor, and all of a sudden Samantha is elected bishop, and Samantha becomes the bishop, and I'm still a pastor. That would be a very interesting thing because, believe it or not, that has happened. That has happened with people in the church, especially mainline churches, where your
spouse is your bishop,
where your spouse is the bishop, mm-hmm. and in some cases it is the woman who has been elected the bishop, mm-hmm. and so that would be that would be
when I think about like being on council as your wife or something like that. For me, it's not that I would disagree with you on things. You and I see the world so similarly. I'd be afraid that I would not take your side, because that's not what counsel is, but like I would feel like people would think that I'm just supporting you because you and I agree on just about everything. Like, if you said something, I would probably take your side, not because you're my husband, but I'd be afraid to be perceived that way, but actually because we agree on almost everything. We see things similarly.
Right, and
I wouldn't be able to get out of my head in that cycle of like, are people thinking I'm just his wife, or am I?
But there's
seen
also
as counsel?
emotional things there. I mean,
yes.
I mean, there's conflicts of interest with even emotional levels. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
It's just too blurry for me. Mm-hmm. I've only recently gotten around to like understanding and embracing the fact that as a pastor's wife, I hate that term, but as a pastor's wife, our blurred line between what is family and what is church is blurred in that context. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It just gets kind of funny. Okay. Pastor's wife. So that was a lot of information. History, gender, me as a pastor's wife a little bit. There you go. There you have it. I think that was our longest episode yet, and I could still say a lot more. If you're interested, read Beth Allison Barr's book about the history of the pastor's wife.
To understand